So we're now basically almost 6 months into the Trump administration.
Yes.
And I think we're at a good point to reflect. And I don't want to say it would be depressing to contemplate the next 3.5 years, because I do think there are elements to the current political setting that hopefully will be revised 18 months from now, which is to say, hopefully the Democrats will regain control of Congress, but more importantly, the Democratic Party and more broadly the American people who do not agree with the Trump administration's immigration policies. There's some pretty good recent polling out that seems to indicate that that's now a fairly strong majority, or that in general don't agree with the way in which Donald Trump is using power to restructure American government and society, ultimately the sense of who is fully included in our society and who we would rather see in a South Sudanese jail, that we will develop the capacities to resist, to thwart, to push back. But I don't see that happening in the next 6 months, right? It's going to be slow. I think it's going to be difficult. It's going to be really hard work. I don't really see it happening until or if the Democrats recapture control of Congress. And so, at least the next 18 months, I think we can get a pretty good sense of from what happened in the last 6 months. And so I've got three different ideas framing my thinking on this, and I will try to go through at least a couple of them in some detail today. One of them is that lawlessness is coming from the Supreme Court, right? It is coming from the institution that is tasked with, more than any other in our society, preserving the rule of law, and especially our fundamental law, the Constitution. And I believe, I will argue with you today, that in various respects, the Supreme Court is not acting in accord with the basic idea of the rule of law, which is that laws have to be stable rules that give us predictability and security about how power can be used, including but not limited to political power. And that the Supreme Court's flexibility, shall we call it, in the way in which it uses the standards it uses to construct the law is so clearly mere covering for its doing what it wants to do. And that among the fundamental things that the arch conservative super majority in the Supreme Court wants to do is to um, and I'll stop for half a second. I'm sorry to interrupt, but somebody just requested captions, and please do that if I don't remember to do that. I'm getting used to the idea that we're supposed to have captions on. I'm sorry that I forgot to enable captions this morning. So sorry, right? That what the Supreme Court, I think, fundamentally wants to do, and I think there are a variety of ways of describing the majority's reigning philosophy, its ideology, if you will. And I need to be careful, right? Because, of course, we're talking about six separate individuals, each of whom have their own ideas. In certain respects, people like Alito and Thomas and Barrett may be interested in Christian nationalism, in the idea that America is fundamentally at its origin dominated by a single religion, that many of our institutions and laws need to be read in light of the assumed uh, hegemony of Christian ideas in our society, and that if we are no longer as thoroughly Christian a nation, and clearly, right, the statistics, the demographics show that we are no longer 90% Christian, right, as we were 60, 70 years ago. But not only that, that the kind of religiosity that people who call themselves Christians now maintain is a much less traditional, much less orthodox form of Christianity. And frankly, that members of the Supreme Court believe it is a corrupt or inauthentic kind of Christianity that permits far too much freedom in the way you interpret the text, allows far too little orthodox imposition of expectations. So there's that idea. Another idea that the regulatory state has grown far too vast, and that the administrative state, which, as I've pointed out to you before, is kind of grafted into the Constitution, where it's taken hold. I think there's no doubt it was a successful graft, but it's a 20th century invention that needed to be implanted in an 18th century framework, using some creativity to do so, that is either fundamentally a mistake, or at least that it has become far too powerful and expansive, right? And so those are some of the things I think that the Supreme Court, at least members of the ultra-conservative ultra majority on the Supreme Court, super majority on the Supreme Court believe. But I also want to add, in addition, that they believe that, in essence, the Warren Court, the court that did the most to bring about the rights revolution of the middle of the 20th century, has basically fundamentally legislated using their authority to interpret the Constitution to instead impose their policy agenda on the country. And that it is now, in essence, incumbent upon this very conservative majority that it took 50 years to get to, all right, $500 million spent on the Federalist Society project of reconstituting the court in this way, needs to undo that revolution. And that, frankly, the court is very limited in its capacity to directly undo what the Warren Court did, not only to the law, but to the society, to the culture, to the nation, right? And as a result of the civil rights revolution, of the women's rights revolution, of the gay rights revolution, of the immigrants' rights revolution, we are now a much more diverse, much more heterogeneous society. We have, right, it clearly in the foreground that we will become a society without a racial majority in, I don't know, the next 25, 30 years, right? I don't think, even with a really aggressive, really nasty form of discriminatory exclusion that the immigration and deportation policy represents, we're going to, right, who knows, maybe slow that down by 5 years, but it's not going to fundamentally change the demographic trends of our society. And similarly, we're not going to restore a traditional religious ethic to most Americans by overturning Roe v. Wade, right, or allowing states to sponsor religious schools, right? Some of the things that the court has done or has considered doing, telegraph that it may do. So with that in mind, then who can? Who can actually take America back to where it was before these disastrous legal decisions and the cultural forces they catalyzed or unleashed transformed America. Well, right, fools rush in. Donald Trump seems to be trying to do that. So I think, in a sense, one of the fundamental guiding visions of the Supreme Court in the second half of the 2025 term was to try to remove impediments to Donald Trump's being able to impose his will on American society via the use of executive power, right? And so, by the way, that is almost by definition a Supreme Court that is then enabling lawlessness. It's enabling the executive to do things without congressional authorization, with things that exceed the power that has been vested in him by the Constitution or the law, and the Supreme Court is abetting this, right? So the Supreme Court, far from being the institution that upholds law, is now an institution that, in many respects, is dismantling the capacity of the federal judiciary to check a lawless president. I think we just have to, right, recognize that this is one of the fixed aspects of our politics for the next 18 months at least. Second of all, we have a Congress that willingly disregards the vital interests of the majority coalition's primary constituents, right? And this is what we talked about at length last week, that the bill just passed, the big, beautiful bill, is a bill that is fundamentally damaging to the right new voters that Trump brought into the MAGA coalition, to the people who are less educated, who have a high school degree or less as opposed to a college degree or more, to the people who are earning less, say people who earn, I don't know where you draw your threshold, $70,000 a year for a family or less, who are experiencing vulnerability, who therefore are currently eligible for and in fact relying on Medicaid, relying on supplemental nutrition assistance program, relying on some of the new jobs that the Inflation Reduction Act and other Biden era legislation have created. And rather than standing up for the people who elected them to office, the Republican Party in Congress fell in line with the president because the president demanded that they do so, or else he would come after them. And so, in a sense, I think their choice was between the possibility of political suicide or the certainty of political homicide, right? The idea that maybe they could actually survive. Let's not have the worst of this stuff take effect until the end of 2026, the beginning of 2027, so we can retain control of Congress, at least for the remainder of the Trump presidency. Right. And I think, frankly, Trump doesn't really care about the long term future of the Republican Party any more than he cares about the long term future of the country. So, with that in mind, I want to add very quickly, right? Possible suicide, maybe not. Certain homicide, and here I think the background, right, to this calculus that we discussed last week, is that the Republican Party, much like the Democratic Party, has become more a tribal identity than an interest coalition. If you are a Republican, it is because you are a certain kind of person, and your belonging to the party marks your identity as that kind of person, less well educated, Christian, Southern, white, traditional, anti-immigration, right? And we could keep going, but I want to add that a substantial portion of the identity is negative. We've talked about negative partisanship, negative hyperpartisanship in the past. The idea that, frankly, what you really believe, among other things, if you're a Republican, is that the Democratic Party represents an existential threat to the future of the kind of country you want to live in. And therefore, okay, well, the Republican Party just took away my Medicaid. And please remember the exchange in Joni Ernst's town hall meeting, right? You know, she says, well, we're taking Medicaid away from people who aren't qualified. Just remember that that's not accurate, that actually the way in which the new requirements on Medicaid will reduce the roles of people who get assistance with their health care expenses from the federal government is primarily because they're so burdensome, they're so onerous, that people are going to, people who are eligible are going to nevertheless fail to qualify because they cannot do the paperwork accurately, sufficiently, on time. And in a sense, this is the way in which this policy saves money in that regard. What does Joni Ernst say? Everybody dies. So everybody dies at some time, right? And so this idea, Mitch McConnell, I think, put it very clearly, they'll get over it. That what matters more in the 21st century is just being on the team with your party. Donald Trump is the leader of the team. The party goes where Donald Trump takes it and assumes that its voters will come with it. And frankly, I hope he's wrong at the margins, but I don't think it's a fundamental miscalculation. And that means that neither Congress nor a political party, which is supposed to do the work, right? The traditional theory of political parties is that they take the interests and views of the people in the society and aggregate them to generate a viable electoral coalition. There's supposed to be something bottom up, or something of a conveyor belt, a mechanism of aggregation and articulation that basically keeps the party aligned with the interests of the people it represents. And that's not the way this party is functioning at all. And I think, frankly, in the 21st century, in an era in which partisanship has become an identity much more than a form of coalitional politics, we need to recognize that Congress is not going to be a check on the president, at least for the next 18 months. And then when the president's dominance politics, right? A form of politics that says, I am dominant in this society and I rule for people I like and people like me, and I am going to punish those I don't like. When that kind of politics is unconstrained, right? And it's unconstrained within his cabinet. There's nobody there, right, to hold him back. And it's increasingly unconstrained within the administrative state, right? Within the broader structures of the federal government. It is the case that Trump was just given the green light, right, by the Supreme Court on its emergency docket to start firing the federal employees he wants to fire. He's probably going to reclassify a whole bunch of federal employees as political appointees, so that civil servants who in previous administrations have been constrained or protected by law to do what they are appointed to do and not simply to do the president's will are increasingly getting the message that they have to do the president's will or they'll be out of a job. And many of them are getting out rather than being part and parcel of this dominance politics. But the result is, right, again, the mechanisms of constraint within the executive branch have fallen away. So the final, right, area of possible constraint would be civil society. And here the combination of the attacks on the uh, law firms, the attacks on the universities, using shows of military force in blue cities, sweeps through parks just to kind of say, yeah, we're here in our full military gear, our body armor, our assault rifles, our masks, so you don't know what you are. Again, right? A politics of intimidation, not just against, right, the employees of the federal government, but against the denizens, the citizens of the states and the cities that might try to organize to resist, even the roughing up of the senator from the other party, right? The idea that we're going to see Donald Trump doing what he wants to do for the next 18 months. What is that? And I'm going to use two labels: autocratic legalism. And so this is a phrase used by Kim Crenshaw, who's a sociologist at Princeton University, who is really thinking about uh, the politics in Hungary and Russia and Turkey, the new kind of autocracy. And one way to describe this is that 20th century autocracy involved troops in the streets and paramilitaries taking over the television tower and the parliament. In the 21st century, and I think, frankly, if we think about Daniel Levitsky, Stephen Sablat, we know that actually this is a longer term trend, at least aspects of it, that it's not the general from the military carrying out the coup. It is the elected leader from within the presidential palace, in our case, the White House, carrying out the transformation of the system of government from a, well, kind of democracy, right? A representative, competitive system of government with some pluralism, into an autocratic form of government in which one person essentially is the locus of most of the political action in the society. And this term implies a transformation of the use of law. The idea that a 19th century theory of law is that law constrains political and social power. It gives us a stable body of rules so that we know what can be done to us by whom, under what conditions, and also what latitude of action and freedom, what sphere of independence we have, right? And so the idea that we are a nation of laws and not of men is rooted in a certain theory of how law operates, right? Laws are created slowly, meticulously through the deliberative institutions of legislatures. They're then promulgated, and they then create the stable charter that society relies on. Autocratic legalism says that the fundamental source of law is the one leader who dominates your society, the personalistic ruler, that they get to say what the law is and how the law is going to be enforced. And they have great flexibility and latitude in using law, not to constrain power, but to amplify their power as an instrument of their dominance. And so, just to take a quick example, right? You have seen, no doubt, that the president declared yesterday that he's imposing tariffs on Brazil. And please note, right, that the statutory authority under which Donald Trump claims the right power to impose a tariff. Well, the statute in question, the right International Economic Emergency Act, doesn't actually say that he can impose tariffs, but he's interpreting it in that way, but relies on the idea that there's some kind of domestic economic emergency. How is Brazil prosecuting their former president who tried to overturn their election? Sound familiar? How is that an American economic emergency? He is just basically recognizing, I am unconstrained. I can do whatever I want to do, and here I go. And he may be wrong, right? There are a couple of court cases that have determined that he can't do this, right? And please note, right, that there have been a couple court cases this week, one of which, right, is on birthright citizenship that has, right, recognized a class that is sufficient, right? It's a class action suit to impose a nationwide injunction, not on the basis of the single case and its generalization, but on the basis of there being a class action sufficient to impose an injunction on a national basis to stop, right, the administration from depriving people born in the United States of their birthright to citizenship. Similarly, there appear to be some fairly sweeping injunctions on deportation still working their way through the courts, right? Now, all of these decisions can be appealed. They may be appealed. They may go through the emergency docket to the Supreme Court. They may be overturned. We'll have to see. I don't think idea that Trump has successfully, completely dismantled the structures that restrain complete autocratic rule by the president. I think that's an exaggeration. I think that's too strong. But he appears to be acting as if this is the case. And by the way, the Supreme Court is abetting him. Congress is not checking him. And so, in large measure, it's down to, right, the whistleblower in the Department of Justice, a circuit court level judge, or a district court level judge. And so I think, right, we should expect there will be more of this for the next 18 months. Donald Trump will continue to act in an arbitrary way to assert his dominance, to intimidate the opposition and those he doesn't like, those who might limit or check his power. And then I want to add one more phrase to the era I think we're entering, right? And as you saw, no doubt, the Supreme Court allowed the transfer of 9 men out of U.S. custody and into a prison in South Sudan, where they are, I think, appropriate to fear the 9 men and the people who care about them, that they will be tortured or killed. None of them is from Sudan, right? So there's something incredibly cruel and capricious about the idea we're just going to find the worst place in the world to put you, and we're going to put you there, right? What does that convey? What is the expressive force of finding the worst place in the world to deport people to? Well, it says basically, you never belonged in our society. You do not deserve full inclusion. yeah, you may have worked here for 30 years, you may have married a citizen, you may have children who are citizens, but you are not a citizen. And therefore, we're going to target you and we're going to do awful things to you, right? And the idea that we are not a society in which your contribution to our economy, the fact that you've worked here for a long time matters anymore, in which, frankly, the color of your skin makes you suspect and potentially targeted for a sweep in which you, if you aren't careful, could end up being deported, is an expression of this idea of discriminatory exclusion, that we are going to um, reassert that this country is a country in which certain categories of people are fully included and other categories of people do not fully belong. And we're going to use the law, the arbitrary use of law, not as a system of rules, but as an instrument of power to do this to you. I think we should expect that that's what the next 18 months at least will hold as well. So that's my dire prediction for the remainder of the period where the political landscape looks the way it looks right now. The Supreme Court, far from in restraining the Trump administration and enforcing the rule of law, is going to try to use its power to restrain those who are restraining Trump, right? The Congress is going to prioritize the loyalty to Trump over the interest of its own constituents. And Donald Trump, who I think has a lust for the use of power to enact dominance and to demonstrate his vision of who is fully American and who is suspect, is going to be emboldened to do more and more of this. That's not obviously a happy picture, but I think being clear eyed about the dangers that the moment holds is essential to those of us who want to see America on a different course, who want to see a country that really does have a Supreme Court that upholds the rule of law, wants to see a Congress that really is a diversely constituted deliberative body, wants to see a civil society in which every kind of American feels equally entitled to give voice to their ideas, including criticisms of the powers that be, and feels equally recognized and included in our social scheme of cooperation. That if that's the kind of America we want, then we have to recognize that we are in danger, that that project, that aspiration is under attack, and that the forces that oppose the aspiration of an inclusive, multiracial, multicultural, progressive America governed by the rule of law, governed by democracy, governed by constitutional rights, that the forces attacking that are ascendant right now. This is a moment of danger, it's an inflection point, and therefore we have to be organized. We have to resist. We have to encourage our political leaders to have the fortitude, the courage, the strength, the organization to do their best to resist. And we have to go to the streets, but we also have to build the organizations of resistance. And it's not unless we are clear eyed about this, and it's not unless we recognize there's a big picture. There's so much coming at us every week, and it's entirely possible to be overwhelmed. There is a sense in which I know more or less who we are in this Zoom room right now. I suspect most of us are exempt from immediate danger, which doesn't mean we don't feel great solidarity for the people who are experiencing immediate danger, but it does mean that it's possible for us, maybe, to just go about our lives and say, well, you know, this too shall pass. And by the way, it's just too depressing to focus on right now. Let's find other avenues of solace and distraction. And I would suggest to you that this is how democracies succumb to autocratic erosion, to backsliding. And if we're really committed, now is the time for us to say, no, we need to not be distracted by all of the outrage. We need to recognize the big picture, and we need to not be intimidated. We need to not be demoralized. We need to recognize, right, like so many generations of brave people before us who fought, right, for their rights, for their inclusion, this is our moment. So, in saying all of this, I'm obviously focusing on the big picture. I now want to go into some of the details. I think maybe I should take a moment before I do so, just to come out of the slides and having framed the overall thing I want to say to you today, ask if you have questions, thoughts, comments, things you want to add before we move into the details. Go ahead, Wilma. You have to
There,
unmute yourself, There you go.
there is evidence that Donald Trump is not over there. Um, he he misspeaks. He can't follow a flow of thought. What if there is no wizard? What if it is not Donald, but powers behind him that are running this show, and that we're all not focused on the real danger?
So I was listening to the Ezra Klein show, and he had a guest on. I think I'm going to get it right, Kaylee Scanlon, and she called Donald Trump an algorithm in a business suit, right? He's just social media embodied, right? And we know he owns a social media company. He came to power through reality TV and then through Twitter, right? He is one of those generational figures who masters the next technology before anybody else does. And because he's the master of the new technology, he is able then to ascend and transform our politics in the process. We also know that social media fractures and fragments attention. And I think part of what Scanlon is saying when she says, right, he's an algorithm in a business suit, is he doesn't have an attention span, right? He can't carry a stream of thought to the end. And so I want to say, in a sense, and we could think of, Article 25 impeachment process here, right? Is Donald Trump, in some way disqualified as a result, or are we missing the fact that there are powers that be behind the scene? And here I want to suggest a slightly different interpretation to you, Wilma, which is, on the one hand, Donald Trump does seem to have some fixed ideas. He doesn't like immigration, and he wants to do things that are cruel enough to immigrants to, first of all, do things that he can't do given the nature of the immigration system, the court system, the enforcement mechanisms, i.e., to get a bunch of people to, quote, self-deport, decide it's not worth being in this country, and get most others who are thinking about coming to this country to think again and turn around and go someplace else, right? And he really likes tariffs, and he seems to think that tariffs generally allow him and by extension the United States to have greater power and to exercise its power, its commercial power effectively vis-a-vis other states. Um, and so, two fixed ideas. There may be some others, but then let us remember, right? A president is almost never exclusively in charge of their presidency. A president assembles an administration, right? And please note, there are thousands of people in a presidential administration. And frankly, the members of the administration cannot be supervised by a single individual. There's a organizational flow chart, right? There are levels of hierarchy, but more often than not, part of what happens is that the people within a presidential administration act on the basis of what they think the president wants without really knowing that the president has told them or authorized to do this. They're doing their best to embody the spirit of the person they work for, right? And I'll just then add, right, that Donald Trump doesn't just have lust for deportation. He has Stephen Miller, right? And Stephen Miller is, competent and monomaniacal, right? And so it's not obviously just Stephen Miller. He has then populated power agencies with people who are similarly focused on this agenda. And he has Scott Bessent, right, when it comes to tariffs. And it's not just him. He's got a number of other people working in critical positions within his government. And so maybe Donald Trump is the algorithm embodied, right? Has no attention span, can't hold a thought, but he's appointed people who are acting out what they see as his agenda. And those people are more stable, are more focused. And so I want to just, say I don't disagree with your assessment of the man necessarily, but I'm not going to call him a puppet, right? I still think, he seems to be more or less as much in command of his faculties as he was 4 years ago or 6 years ago or 8 years ago. And he seems to be, in many respects, I don't know how much of it is just the optics of power, how much of it is choosing his fights, how much of it is luck, but in many respects succeeding, right? He's getting the Supreme Court to let him do what he wants to do. He just got one of the biggest bills ever got through that Congress has ever passed through Congress. And by the way, he did it by his July 4th deadline. So when I go out to my driveway on the 4th of July and I pick up the newspaper, the headline is Trump's big, beautiful bill passed, right? You can think of what the alternative headlines might have been if that bill had not passed on that day, right? So in many respects, I want to say he's succeeding, and that's where we have to really focus the danger that his success represents to our society and its fragile commitment to the rule of law, to civil rights, to democracy. Yeah, thank you, Wilma. Interesting way to think about this and frame this. Anybody else before I move on? Flossie, please go ahead. You're ready. Just talk. Yeah, Flossie, go ahead.
I think that the churches, the religious institutions, have to focus on his being the Antichrist. And they really have to mean it. In addition to being the anti-democracy, and everything that makes a mockery of our institutions, we have to hit on how cruel, how inhuman every one of his policies happens to be. Inhuman, Antichrist, everything that the testament he destroys He is the devil. And I think that it is, of course, dramatic. It has to be. And when we go out to protest, we have to use strong language. We have to refer to the Supreme Court justice as the guy who loved movies so much that his favorite film was North by Northwest. He has the intelligence quotient of an ant. And as long as we're not asking people to shoot one another and kill one another. We have to remember where we came from, what gave us the democracy. What gave us the democracy was an ideal, and we recite and sing the Gettysburg Address. Now, a lot of people won't understand it, but if we sing it enough, they will hear it. And I think that Piedmont Gardens has a lot of good voices. Thanks.
So thank you, Flossie. I love the idea of singing the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to
No, but reciting it.
I'm going to ask you, right? So Abraham Lincoln, the author of the Gettysburg Address, um, Martin Luther King Jr., the man who, right, invoked it in such a powerful way, Mahatma Gandhi, who inspired, right, Martin Luther King Jr. Do you think any of them would have referred to even the politicians who they most opposed, who were most adverse to freedom and equality and dignity, as the Antichrist? And I, but my obvious suggestion is they wouldn't have used that kind of heated rhetoric for two reasons. The first is because it is inflammatory, and I can hear you immediately saying we don't endorse violence, but I think you have to recognize that when you call somebody the Antichrist, there may be people out there who hear that who are not as stable, who are not as clear cut about the distinction between a rhetorical ploy and a literal description, and who may be motivated to do
Let's
awful things.
say you keep the Antichrist in the churches.
Yeah.
People go to worship. Outside, we have, shall we say, stronger rhetoric, more satiric rhetoric, where we make a mockery of some of those idiots who really have some degree of education and think that they can crawl into their tunnels and go underground and come out one day and think that there is a country left, because that's where they're going. The
Well,
billionaires especially going underground, and they hope one day they will come out. And what? What will their world be?
so Flossie, I'm going to keep pushing back, and I know you can take it.
Uh,
I want to hear what you have to say in response. I'm also going to point out that there's a substantial portion of Americans, and we talked a little bit about this last week with Arlie Russell Hochschild's Stolen Pride, who feel like the elite of this country, especially the liberal elite of this country, have just completely forgotten about them, that the liberal elite cares about feminists and they care about civil rights and critical race theory and about immigrants, but they don't give a damn about the white working class who have seen their fortunes plummet. Now, I'm not endorsing. Obviously, I'm critical of the content of that claim. But then notice, right, that those people also feel, right, that in basic respects, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris did not seem to understand them, was not relatable to them. Maybe Joe Biden was a little bit better, but then Joe Biden didn't seem to do much for them. and that Donald Trump gets them, that Donald Trump hears them, that Donald Trump feels them, that Donald Trump is giving expression to the experience that they've had in this country over the last 50 years of sustained downward mobility and growing precariousness, and that at least he channels their anger, right? And so I want to say, frankly, you know, we Democrats might win control of Congress in 2026, right? Just by staying the course, just because Donald Trump is so extreme that he ends up pushing the middle of the road average voter back to the Democratic Party. Some of that dynamic already seems to be taking hold. But frankly, do we then win in 2028? Do we win enough of a majority to actually be able to legislate for the next 2 or 4 years if we haven't managed to reach out to the people who are currently, right, enamored of Donald Trump? And if we call Donald Trump the Antichrist, are we in any way persuading the people who might be persuadable, as opposed to saying to them, we understand why you have so much pent up anger and grievance at what has happened in this country for the last 50 years. And we understand that Donald Trump is masterful at expressing that pent up anger and grievance. But please notice, while he's doing that, he is fleecing you, right? He is taking away the things you need to live on. And don't be fooled, right? Yes, he's really good at channeling anger at the liberal elites, but boy, is he also really good at funneling money to his cronies, right? I just think a different tact may be better. And by the way, that doesn't mean we don't have to be organized and resisting the deportations and the lawlessness and the effort to make America much more hostile to people of color and people who are, right, gay or trans or non-traditional or unchristian, right? I think there are lots of things where we just have to be prepared to resist. But I also think we need at the same time to figure out how to do that while trying to constitute a broader coalition for a more progressive vision of our country. And so, as much as I despise Donald Trump, as much as I have a hard time sometimes believing that my country is taking people off of its streets and sending them to South Sudan, you know, it is still the case that I have to recognize that I have fellow citizens who I think I could reach and motivate them to change their minds. And I'm got to figure out how to do that. And I'm not sure that describing Donald Trump as the Antichrist is the way to do that. I'm pretty sure it's not.
And we have to use satire to get to the Clintons and Pamela Harris. We have to make them look stupid, aristocratic, not caring. Now, that's a hard job, but that's the other way. We have to expose their seeming indifference. What do they have up their sleeves? And there's a lot to remember that they have big sleeves.
Yeah, and I love Taco. Trump always caves in, right? What is it? Chickens out. Trump always chickens out. Sorry, and by the way, last Wednesday was 90 days, right? Where are all the tariffs? Well, I'm not really hoping for tariffs, but having said that, all of a sudden it's August 1st, right? And I don't know what'll happen between now and then, but to point out through satire, through humor, through forms of criticism that seem to show Donald Trump to be other than what he appears to be to the people who support him, as opposed to primarily addressing ourselves to the people who already despise him. That's my
And,
challenge, and
well,
I think it's hard.
in,
And part of the problem is he is masterful in this new media environment, and a lot of the people who support him are very good in this new media environment. And by the way, this new media environment is not neutral. It favors his kind of politics over our kinds of politics. It favors divisiveness and narrowness and exclusion and meanness over inclusion and mutual respect and social cooperation working together. But we have to figure out ways to use this system to convey our sincere hope that we can still come together and do some things together that are actually promoting, yes, the interests of the white working class, but at the same time, the interests of recent immigrants and long suffering African Americans, etc. I know David has had his hand up for a little while. Flossie, can I let him into the conversation too?
let the conversation return to our community.
Very good. David, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, and I know we've addressed this theme before, but I think it is the secret. We have to give rural America and working class folks everywhere a reason to have faith in the Democratic Party. And right now, they don't have one. I think our best arguments are Trump's lack of real concern for them, what you suggested. And on the economic front, I think we should be able to make that argument. But I think we have to find a way for them to be ideologically comfortable under that Democratic umbrella. And I'm not sure quite how to do that because Trump clearly has the cultural issues on his side right now. But I think that's what it takes. I'm reminded of the fact that I lived in Minnesota for 12 years, and we used to have the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. That was the name of it in Minnesota, still is, I believe. But somehow now we don't have very many farmers and we don't have very many laborers under that umbrella. And
Yeah.
somehow we have to invite those folks back in. And I do agree with you. And sorry about this, Flossie. I think attacking Trump and vilifying him will only rigidify the conservative response.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember that in many ways, partisanship in the 21st century, unlike partisanship through most of the 20th century, really has become identitarian. It really is, like attacking somebody's religion. You don't convert somebody by attacking their religion as false, right? And it's a strained metaphor, but I do think in many respects, right, the idea that the other side is an existential threat is part of what mobilizes the voters to support Trump. And so if we start acting like, yeah, you're damn right, we're an existential threat and we're coming after you, they may double down in their
Yeah.
sense that we need this strong man to protect us from them. Right. And as opposed to that, if we can say, and by the way, here I think, we can't assume that the Democrats are actually pursuing the policies that are more beneficial to the people who support Trump, right? The large majority of the people being people with less education, less income. Obviously, he's got his cronies in Silicon Valley and the petrochemical industries, but the people who are suffering in our society as a result of our transition to a different kind of economy that is much less favorable to their interests, and it's going to keep getting worse, right? We're 5 years, I guess, from fully autonomous self-driving vehicles, that's the number one form of male employment in our country, right? And so just a whole bunch of people who don't have a college education, but right now have a pretty good job, are going to
Yeah.
lose that job in the next 5 years. The
Well,
Democrats need to credibly say, we're not really the party of the college educated elite. We have been and will again be, I like the way FDR put it, the working man's party. I mean, maybe we now need to say in the 21st century, the working person's party. But the idea, frankly, that in the 21st century, we may need new ideas, and those ideas may be quite different and initially hard to sell. But if we're about to enter an economy where a whole bunch of work goes away, right? Either we're going to have even more discontent, even more poison coursing through our politics, or we're going to start thinking in, I think, fundamentally different ways. Universal basic income, universal wealth, policies that really begin to restore the charter of social cooperation and say, we're all in this together and we're going to make sure we have everyone's back. The Democratic Party has not been able to do that credibly for a long time, in part because of who finances their politics, right? We can't pretend it's only the Republicans who have blocked the Democrats from doing what they want to do. The very constituencies on which the Democrats rely have also blocked the Democrats from doing what they want to do. We need to be able to be critical of ourselves at the same time that we're resisting Trump. Well,
yeah. Can I just add one thing?
yeah,
A,
please do
a
that.
possible mantra is, and I don't know if I'd say this out loud, but it's really the point of it, is we have to convince people that they have more to fear from oligarchs than immigrants.
Nice, nice. Um, I think this may be a new record, which is to say, we've gone a whole hour and I've shared one slide with you, and it's only my title slide. So I owe you a promissory note. I'm going to give it right now. I had a lot of stuff I wanted to talk with you about, especially about the uh, hypocrisy of the Supreme Court. And so I think it's worthwhile being able to think about this in some detail. How the Supreme Court is pivoting from one doctrine, one standard, one stance about the law. Is the right way to interpret the law and the Constitution originalism, textualism, as it's sometimes called? We've got to literally construct what it meant to the people who passed it, or is it a kind of pragmatism? Right. And depending upon whether or not originalism lets them get to the conclusion they want to get to or not, there are originalists of convenience and pragmatists of convenience. And this is, I think, just so clear at this point that the court really is not upholding the law, because in order to uphold the law, you have to have stable standards for constructing and interpreting the law, or else the law can be made to mean whatever you want it to mean. And alas, I'm afraid that it looks to me, drawing on a bunch of critics, including some of the dissents issued by the very members of the Supreme Court, that the court is increasingly itself an institution that is dismantling rather than upholding the rule of law in the United States. So that's one of the places I intended to go with you today. We will go there together next week. Really good being with all of you. I know this is tricky stuff. I do think, right, having the capacity to say it out loud, to talk about it, to figure out what to do about it does help us to maintain, I hope, some sanity, some safety, some solidarity in trying times. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with you next week. Hang in there, be well, to be continued. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
See you next
Thank
week.
you.
Bye, guys.